Alright guys, today we are talking about one item and one item only, and it's an ND filter. So for those of you who don't know what an ND filter does, let me demonstrate with the best way that I can think of. ND filter stands for neutral density filter, and what this does is basically, if you can't see through there, cuts out light. So if you're shooting photos or video and you need to cut out just a little bit more light without changing your settings, this is going to be what you want to use. The cool thing about a variable ND filter is as you turn the dial, it gets darker and darker. So this ND filter can block out from 1.3 to 8 stops, I believe. So not as much for photography, but for videography, this is going to be a vital part of your kit. Let me tell you why. So when you are shooting a video, your settings aren't able to be changed up as much as when you're shooting photos. For instance, if you're shooting outside in the bright daylight, your ISO is at 100, you have, your aperture where you want it. Let's say you want it to be wide open at 2.8 or 1.8 to get that depth of field, but it just makes your photo completely blown out and bright. You can usually, depending on the situation, crank your shutter speed to 1/1000th, 1/2000th, or higher up to a pretty fast shutter speed and still get the result that you want, effectively using the shutter speed to control your exposure. Now with video, you can't really do that. So if you don't know about the 180-degree shutter rule, we will run through it. Basically, let's say you're shooting at 24 frames a second. You want your shutter speed to be at or around double that number. So for this video, I'm shooting at 24 frames a second. So my shutter speed is at 1/50th of a second. Doing that creates the most realistic motion blur and really gives, the cinematic feel to a video. You can mess around with that. I know that for me, there have been times in music videos where I've taken the shutter speed and either lowered it to create a blurring effect or cranked it up to create kind of a frantic effect in terms of the blur and the feel of the video. But usually you want your shutter speed to be double what your frame rate is for the video. Now let's back up. When you're doing that, because you can't or don't usually want to adjust your shutter speed, and also if you're recording at 24 frames a second, your shutter speed is pretty slow, allowing even more light in. If you're recording in bright daylight or a pretty well lit area, your shot's gonna be at least a little or a lot overexposed. So that is where an ND filter comes into play. So let's say you're recording your short film or your music video or your interview, and you have your ISO as low as it can go, you have your aperture where you want it to be for the depth of field you're going for, and then you are recording at 24 frames a second, so you want your shutter to be 1/50th of a second, but your shot is still extremely bright. Now, you could crank that shutter speed and have the shot look a little off from what you really want it to look like, or you could pick yourself up a variable ND filter, pop that on your lens, and then turn this until you get to the amount of light you want to block out, until you get your exposure at a perfect exposure or wherever you're trying to go creatively, and voila. You don't have to mess with any of your settings. All your settings can stay the same, but you can get the exposure that you want. Now, that being said, there are a few downsides to using an ND filter. The most obvious is you're basically adding in another setting that you have to adjust in your camera. Anytime I'm shooting video outside, I have an ND filter on. Occasionally when I'm shooting photos, I also have one on. Sometimes if I want to do long exposures, but it's not, extremely dark out, I'll have to use an ND filter to help counteract the amount of light coming into the camera. But when you have that on, you have this is depending on if you shoot fully manual or aperture priority, shutter priority. I shoot fully manual, manual white balance, manual ISO, manual everything, but that's how I like to shoot. So that means I have shutter speed to worry about, I have aperture to worry about, I have ISO to worry about, I have white balance to worry about, and then I also now have the setting of this ND filter to worry about. So it adds in another setting that you have to think about in your shooting situation. Now, that being said, there are ND filters that are set at one single stop, which make their upsides and downsides to that. So you can get an ND filter that only blocks out 2 stops of light, but you can't adjust it, which is good and bad. Good because there's not a lot of negative effects that come with it. One of the negative effects is when you use a variable ND filter, there gets a point as you're turning as you're adjusting the filter where cross polarization can happen. Since the filter has polarizers in it, see if I can get it to show on here. If you look right there, there's a little X on there. What that's telling you, what that X on the side is telling me, is that's where cross polarization can start to happen. Now in variable ND filters, once you get to a certain stop value, you can start to see an X over your picture. So you have to watch out for that with the variable ND filters. Cool thing about this ProMaster one that I have right here is it tells me when that can start, so I can watch out for it. But that is also a downside of using a variable ND, and one of the upsides of using just a static one setting or one stop value ND filter. Now, other than the cross polarization, the extra setting, one thing you want to watch out for is not getting a crappy ND filter to put in front of a really nice lens. I see a lot of people do this at my camera store where they will get a $2,000 piece of glass or lens, and then they will go and pick up a $15 UV filter to slap on the front of that lens. What you're basically doing is spending a ton of money on an extremely nice piece of glass and then putting a really crappy piece of glass in front of it to just kind of ruin the shot. You'll start to get lens flares, you'll start to get weird reflections, and it's just completely defeats the purpose of having a nice piece of glass. That being said, if you buy an ND filter or you buy a UV filter or even a circular polarizer, make sure you get one that is quality, at least one that matches the quality of your lens. Now I'm shooting on a Tamron lens here, so kind of a budget option, but still a really nice piece of glass. This filter, I got the HGX Prime variable ND filter from ProMaster, so this is going to be their highest end variable ND filter. I tore off the tag, but I believe this is about $170 variable ND filter. So this one is a very high quality, very nice glass filter, so it's not really going to hinder the quality of the lens I have on my camera. But other than those few downsides to throwing an ND filter on your camera, there is really just the upside of helping give you more creative control over your images or your video. Like I said, for photography, I know a lot of people who use them. You don't necessarily need them unless you're in a really extreme bright situation or you want to do a slow shutter speed for blurring effects. But for video, if you are shooting anywhere outside or anywhere where you won't need to actually turn up your ISO to get light, you will 99% of the time need to pick up an ND filter or a variable ND filter so that you can control that light and keep your settings exactly where you want them to be. So I think that is about it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you learned something, give it a thumbs up down below. I will be releasing more videos like this one and some editing tutorials and other gear reviews in the near future. So if you like that kind of content, definitely subscribe down below, and I will see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.